Already deep into his second-term trade wars, President Trump now doubling his punch on steel and aluminum tariffs.
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
Tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50%, yeah, they're now in effect. CNN's Vanessa Yurkevich is at the Magic Wall to explain how this major increase may be passed on to consumers. Vanessa, what could be the impact caused by this doubling of those steel and aluminum tariffs?
The latest tariffs on steel and aluminum are unjustified. They're illegal. They're bad for American workers, bad for American industry, and of course for Canadian industry as well. We have counter tariffs in a gross amount before remissions on over 90 billion of U.S. imports. We've acted strong. Those are in place.
It started as a move of strength. At least that's what Americans were told. A 50% tariff on foreign aluminum. A bold strike meant to bring manufacturing back home, to punish cheap imports, to make America strong again. But almost overnight, something unexpected happened. Something nobody in Washington was ready for. The U.S. didn't tighten its grip on the aluminum market. It lost it. And the country that stepped in took control and quietly walked away with the future of North America's aluminum supply. Wasn't China. It wasn't even Europe. It was Canada, more specifically Quebec. And what happened next has left American manufacturers furious, the White House scrambling, and global buyers rushing to lock down Canadian supply before the U.S. can even react. This is the story of how a single trade decision triggered a $12 billion power shift in North America, and why analysts now fear that the U.S. may never regain control of its aluminum supply chain again. It begins on a single day when prices inside America exploded. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly. The moment the 50% tariff was announced, U.S. aluminum prices jumped over 54% overnight. Factories across America went from stable to panicked in less than 24 hours. Executives from Detroit to Dallas were suddenly making emergency calls, trying to figure out how to source metal without going bankrupt. Because the truth is simple but brutal. America doesn't produce enough aluminum to survive on its own. For the last decade, U.S. smelters have been shutting down one after another. Too expensive to operate, too energy intensive, too uncompetitive globally. And the country that has quietly filled that gap year after year has been Canada, not just because it's close, not just because it's an ally, but because Canada, in particular Quebec, produces the cheapest, cleanest, hydropower-driven aluminum on Earth. So when Washington tried to close the door, they didn't weaken Canada. They handed it a golden opportunity, and Quebec did not waste a single second. Within weeks, something massive started moving behind the scenes. Meetings between aluminum executives, negotiations with Hydro-Quebec, a long-term energy contract that would lock in ultra-cheap power until 2045, a guarantee that Quebec smelters could run at full force while American factories were struggling to afford even half their usual shipments. Then came the headline that shook the global market. Canada signs multi-billion-dollar aluminum power deal. To outsiders, it looked like normal business. To people inside the industry, it was a nuclear bomb. The deal meant Canadian smelters, especially the giant Aluminary, Alouette in Quebec, would get guaranteed low-cost hydropower for decades. That one move alone meant they could ramp up production while U.S. smelters were cutting shifts, furloughing workers, and watching prices spiral out of control. And the value, when analysts estimated the long-term benefit of the contract, the number was staggering. $12 billion. Not in vague projections, not in hypothetical benefits. Real, calculated, locked-in economic advantage. And as prices in America kept rising, something even more troubling happened. Global buyers began cutting the U.S. out of future supply agreements. European auto companies, Asian electronics manufacturers, even American brands with overseas production. Why? Because they wanted stable, predictable, low-carbon aluminum. And now Quebec was offering exactly that, while the U.S. market was drowning in volatility, political risk, and sky-high costs. So buyers rushed toward Canada. They signed multi-year offtake contracts. They locked in future volumes. They claimed production slots that U.S. companies desperately needed. Suddenly, the United States wasn't just paying more for aluminum, it was falling to the back of the line. And once those long-term deals are signed, breaking them is nearly impossible. That's why industry analysts were shocked when internal documents leaked, showing that several major buyers had already committed to Quebec's supply until 2030 and beyond. America had isolated itself. Canada had capitalized, and the fallout was only getting started. Inside U.S. factories, the situation turned dire. Auto plants reported cost spikes so steep that vehicle production models had to be rewritten. Appliance manufacturers saw their profit margins collapse by double digits. Even defense contractors who rely on aluminum for aircraft, armor, and missile casings warning Washington that supply shortages could disrupt military schedules. This wasn't just an economic issue, it was a national security issue. And Canada was now the uncontested gatekeeper of the cleanest, most affordable aluminum in North America. Meanwhile, in Quebec, the mood was the exact opposite. Smelters celebrated record investments. Thousands of jobs were protected. Expansion plans resurfaced. Hydropower, Quebec's greatest advantage, became the centerpiece of a new industrial strategy. Where the U.S. saw chaos, Quebec saw opportunity. Where the U.S. struggled with price shock, Quebec saw long-term stability. Where the U.S. imposed tariffs to regain control, Quebec used those very tariffs to take control. And then came the moment that infuriated Washington. Ottawa announced that due to American tariffs, it would prioritize non-U.S. buyers for future aluminum exports. Not permanently, not officially, but in practice. That's exactly what began happening. Because from a business standpoint, the math was simple. Why sell to a U.S. buyer paying unstable, politically driven premiums when European and Asian buyers were offering long-term, stable contracts backed by green energy incentives? Why choose chaos when you can choose certainty? And that is exactly how the United States accidentally pushed itself out of its own aluminum supply. The final domino fell when analysts released a report showing the long-term consequences of the tariff. U.S. manufacturers will pay billions more in aluminum costs. Canadian producers will gain market share for the next decade. Quebec could become the world's largest supplier of low-carbon aluminum. And America's ability to influence North America's metal market may never return to pre-tariff levels. That report spread through financial circles like wildfire. Suddenly, investors weren't looking at U.S. smelters anymore. They were looking at Quebec, at hydropower, at the stability created by the multi-decade contract. And slowly, quietly, the center of gravity shifted. North America's aluminum crown didn't belong to the United States anymore. It belonged to Canada, and not just any part of Canada. Quebec, the province that turned a U.S. trade war into a once-in-a-generation economic advantage, the place that used hydropower, not politics, to reshape the entire market. The region that walked away with a deal worth $12 billion in long-term value, while the U.S. walked away with higher prices, panicked manufacturers, and a shrinking voice in its own supply chain. And perhaps the most ironic twist of all, the United States never intended to hand over its aluminum future. It wanted to protect it, but in trying to build a wall, it built a doorway that Canada walked through with ease. And now that Quebec has secured buyers, locked in power rates, and expanded its production capacity, reversing this shift may be impossible. Because once global industries choose stability, they rarely go back. Once they secure long-term green aluminum contracts, they rarely renegotiate. And once America signaled that its aluminum market can be flipped upside down with a single political decision, buyers decided it was safer to look north. This is the new reality. A United States paying more for the metal it desperately needs, a Canada exporting more than ever before, and a Quebec aluminum industry sitting on decades of guaranteed power, guaranteed demand, and guaranteed profit. What began as a tariff has now become a continental power shift, one that reshaped factories, divided supply chains, and sent America scrambling to fix a crisis it accidentally created. Because the truth is simple. You can't win a trade war when the other side has cheaper energy, stronger contracts, and a tighter grip on the future. And right now, that advantage belongs entirely to Canada, and Quebec is holding it with both hands.